So why don't we talk about your origin story? How did you get into film in the first place, and how did you end up doing all of those jobs?
I don't think I come from necessarily a traditional film background. I started quite what I guess you could arguably say quite late in the game based on sort of conversations with my peers, if you will. I went to film school when I was 35 years old, and a lot of the students that I was in class with were 19, 20, 21. So I was really doing quite a bit of a reset at that time. It was interesting because I made that decision to go. I had been working, variety of sort of adult jobs, if you will, for many years. And my career path at that time was to be a financial advisor. In fact, that's what I had been doing since about 2000 was I was a financial advisor. And so I sold insurance. I did investment planning, financial planning with people. I had built a relatively I would say a modest career out of that, and was enjoying myself. And but I always thought to myself, this just wasn't what I was meant to do. It harkened back to when I was a kid. I loved playing with action figures. I remember when I was a kid, when we were learning animation in school, and learning how to do little stick drawings and movements and things like that, and how exciting that was, and how playing with action figures and pretending to be reenacting scenes from Star Wars movies and so on were so fascinating to me. And I love telling stories. And so it was just a storytelling, anything that I could do to tell a story was really what fascinated me. And so I was going for a walk downtown one day, and I happened to walk by the Vancouver Film School. And I thought to myself, I've always wanted to explore what it would be like to get into the film industry. So I made a couple of phone calls and got to see one of their advisors. I realized at that point, I was like, well, this feels like the right place, the right thing to start doing now. Now, whether or not I want to go to film school or not, I wasn't quite sure at the time, but I also didn't know any other pathway in, right? At that time, YouTube and all these other things were still very new to the table. And so you couldn't really learn much. And I didn't really know anybody in the industry, or at least not anybody who I could reasonably call on to give me any kind of advice or anything like that. And so it seemed to me at the time that film school was really the way for me to break out of what I was doing and jump into this full bore. And so I took the money I had saved to put down a down payment on a condo in Gastown. And
You're regretting that now, though, right? With the with the housing prices and what they are.
yeah, Gastown condo was probably about, I think if I remember correctly, it was like $350,000 or something like that. It was kind of like 350, $400,000 was basically the cost of to go down. And so I had like just enough to put a down payment down. And I was thinking to myself, that was definitely the way to go. But then, I regret it from maybe I'd be wealthier right now than I was. But I also think I would have locked myself into something that I knew I wasn't going to stay in, or I knew I couldn't stay in and have an enjoyable life. So it was really a leap of faith. And the real crux of it came when I went to tell my folks that I wanted to explore this path. My mom and my dad both basically said, well, that makes perfect sense. That's what you should have been doing all along. That was a real vote of confidence, I would say, in the decision I was about to make, because I really had no idea what this meant. Even the idea of going back to school at 35 is somewhat daunting for most people. There's a little bit of humble pie and a little bit of realizing that you're now going to be in classrooms with effectively teenagers. That was kind of a bit of humble pie to do. But I thought to myself, look, if I'm going to do this, I've got to do this full bore. Like I can't wade in halfway, because if I wade in halfway, I'm never going to go. I'm never going to do it. I'll dabble. I might work on set a couple times, but I'll always be drawn back to, oh yeah, but I have a condo to pay for, and I have this to pay. Like there's always going to be something that's going to prevent me from kicking in. And so the funny part is that I didn't really even have to take too much of that to go to school, but because I wound up getting their scholarship through Vancouver Film School, and I went through their foundation program first, which it's kind of the entry level position, if you will, the entry level to getting in. And the wonderful part about going to foundation before going to film production was I was introduced to the entire world of art and visual design. So I got to explore life drawing, like doing life drawing for about half a year. I learned how to paint. I learned how to take photographs and tell stories through still images, learned how to storyboard, and we did some screenwriting classes and we did some acting classes. So there was filmmaking as a part of it, which was always the goal that I wanted to be I thought, well, I want to be a filmmaker, but I was exploring all of these other avenues at the same time. I was exploring, animation. We did 2D animation and we did 3D animation. I got introduced for 3 months to Maya and got to play around and made a goldfish swim in a bowl kind of thing. That really opened my eyes to the bigger world of just making visually interesting storytelling. And a lot of it was geared towards, pushing people into other programs with VFS. But, and a lot of the classmates that I had were really good animators, like really good animators. And a lot of them wound up going into 3D animation and so on. And I always knew my path was going to be, I wanted to get into narrative filmmaking. That was where I thought my path was really going to be. But what was interesting about going to foundation too is like I never saw myself as a person who could draw, and I never saw myself as a person who had any quality, like any kind of talent or skill in these kind of fields. Once I went there, I realized it just didn't matter. Like it didn't matter that I couldn't draw. I learned to draw. I taught myself to draw, and I sort of peeled back the onion. I had really good instructors who just were like, who were not easy on me, but they were also very encouraging. Like they would be the kind of people who I could tell, like my life drawing of a nude sitting in the middle, live nude sitting in the middle of the classroom was by far and away, on the low end of the spectrum in terms of skill level compared to like the person sitting right next to me. Like I could see what he was doing, or I could see what she was doing, and just go like, holy man, like I am way out of my league here. But I was having fun and I was really enjoying it. And I just loved the idea of getting better at this. And that was something that just really kept encouraging me. I was like, well, every day I'm just getting better at doing this stuff. I went to film school after that. I went right into film production right as soon as I finished the foundation program, and that changed a lot of my perspective because now we got into the technical side of things. So I made a point of myself once I kind of saw how the layout of the program was going to be that I wanted to do as many jobs on set as possible. We had an opportunity in film school to make a documentary in your first term, you work on two short films in your third term, and you work on two short films in kind of your fifth and sixth terms. And I was like, I want to make sure I do a different job on every set. So I don't want to take on just one thing. So I did assistant directing, I did directing, I did producing on one, and then the last one that we did, which we were able to shoot on Super 16 film, I got to be the cinematographer, which was really cool. And of course, this is in a time we didn't have video taps or anything like that. So being the cinematographer on a film shoot, you had to do a lot of mental training to do that because you had to plan out everything and you had to know that it was going to work and go from there. And I really felt cool about it because again, it was something where I kept thinking to myself, am I really getting better at this? I still always felt like I had imposter syndrome in it. Like, who am I at this age? I'm a far more money person. Like I know more about like financial stuff. I can do budgets, I can do Excel sheets, and I'm here trying to be an artist. And I always felt like I had this imposter syndrome between being an artist and being a finance person. And that for me, I constantly was trying to not to prove to other people, but to prove to myself, like, no, 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 you belong here. Like you're okay here. I learned that by just like being on set with other film productions. Like I would volunteer when possible to work on the classes above me would always be doing their projects, and so I was always trying to get on their sets as like a PA on a weekend or something like that, and just see how they were putting these things together. I volunteered for a Crazy Eight film. It was when Crazy Eights kind of started to come back, and it was like I knew a guy who was producing one of the Crazy Eights films, and I said, "Well, I'd love to come out and help one day." And this was on a weekend while I was still in film school. And so he said, "Okay, we'll come out and you can PA and just like help clean up garbage." I was like, "Cool, I'm in. Like, bring me on board." It was called The Green Film. It was basically about the idea of making an eco-friendly film set. And that's basically what it was. It was a film about making a film in an eco-friendly way. We had just like the best people working on this particular film. And it was the very first time the red camera had been used in BC. And so even the DP at that time was like, how do I use this camera? And so we were shooting on a red, and the red broke down, as reds did. And so we had to get the duplicate. So it was always funny because that the coin phrase of like oh, another red problem and so on. And red cameras are great, but at that time they were definitely glitchy.
Yeah, now they're great. They fixed that problem. But back then, we also, when we were shooting, you had to have two cameras.
Something always went wrong, and people were always like going, I don't know what do we do here. Basically, the crew I worked with were the crew who were kind of like working on Stargate and stuff like that. Like they were working on the bigger TV shows in town. And we shot at Bridge Studios for 2 days on the weekend, and we actually got permission to shoot on the Stargate set on the visual effects stage, the old visual effects stage that they had there. So we filmed an entire scene on that, and it was set up as like a medieval village, and we filmed on their set. I remember like one of the days for like 3 hours, basically they said, okay, we're setting up a giant 20 by 20 diffusion, whatever you call it. Like, yeah, now it escapes me. But the thing is, because it was outside and we didn't have enough sandbags, so I had to stand on the junior for like basically, or the combo for like basically like 3 hours to make sure it didn't fly away. That's what they told me to do. So I just sat there and I was like, okay, just bring me. People just brought me like water and food and stuff like that, and I was like, well, this is fun. This is a way to spend your day. And then I got kind of brought into when we went to the Stargate set. I got brought onto the lighting team to help them out because we had enough PAs there. And so they were like, okay, well, why don't you come work on the lighting team? And so I went on the lighting team. And I remember what happened was our 20K HMI, which is like a big light that's essentially designed to make the interior look like we're outside in the sky, makes it feel like you're outside. And I remember it shorted. And the gaffer that was working on the film, he's like, okay, so like we don't have light, we don't have that sunlight now. And so, but he said, but if you go across the lot to the other stage over there, they're filming Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. Go to the store, grab a case of beer, go to that set, and see if we can borrow one of their lights. And so I drove to the store, grabbed a case of beer, came back, and went over, and they told me to talk to, I can't remember the guy's name. Told me to talk to a guy, and the guy, and so I did. And I went and talked to him, and he's like, sure, just like just bring it back when you guys are done. Like make sure you roll it back. Don't leave it over at that other stage. I'm on the Dr. Parnassus set, and I'm looking at all the people up there filming this bigger, much bigger thing. And now me and like three other guys are like rolling this 20K over from their set to the visual effects stage. Anyway, this whole thing was just like, I was like, okay, so this is filmmaking. Like it was just such a cool environment, and this is what it is. And so I did film school. I did the cinematography. I did all this stuff. I got out of that. I talked to a teacher there who was more into documentaries. I would go back and forth, and I'd have like lunch with him every once in a while after I finished film school. And this was in 2009. And I remember at that time I was like trying to come up with an idea for a documentary. For some reason I thought, oh, I'm going to see, because people were saying, oh, you know what, one thing you should try to get into is documentary right now, especially because we'd just come out of that writer's strike of 2008, and people were saying that documentaries might be a better way into the industry right now because the industry is kind of slow and all these other things. So I came up with this idea for a documentary about hockey fighting, like hockey fighters. And I always saw them as like sort of this like the gladiators of the sport kind of thing. And, we're going to try to get interviews with famous hockey fighters and kind of find out what what their philosophy was, and like, why did they find themselves in that role and things like that as a player. Cause obviously like most hockey players growing up, you don't grow up with this idea of being a hockey fighter. You grow up as wanting to be Wayne Gretzky. Like that's kind of how you want to do it. And this kind of harkens back to, again, this idea of like playing with action figures. What I used to do as a kid, like I never played hockey growing up, but what I did do, I loved hockey as a sport. I loved watching it. I loved the storytelling behind it. I always loved like, if there was a person who I wanted to get to the game an hour earlier so I could go into the bowels of the Coliseum and see like the Zamboni, the Zamboni driver. I would never leave my seat if I went to a hockey game. Like I just loved staying in the seat. For me, watching the Zamboni drive around and scrape the ice was as sometimes as interesting as watching the game. And I loved just watching all of the behind the scenes of how that worked. Like how did it work? I really wanted to learn how do they make hockey, like how does hockey ice get done. Anyway, this idea of storytelling was, I would take, like when I was a kid, I would take chess pieces, and my dad created this like kind of semi-glass plastic hockey rink that was like a board, like a almost like a board game. And I would take chess pieces and I would like put little helmets on them made out of paper. And I would like reenact hockey games every Saturday night. For me, it was the story of the game. Like I was creating a story of the how the game was going to turn out. And, I would create little like fights between pawns on the ice, things like that. And I love just watching like the fire sale of gear all over the place. And it was fun. I'd kick around a little puck that was the funny part was we had a table hockey game, but I much preferred playing with these chess pieces. I didn't know I was directing the story, but I was, as I look back on it, that's what I was thinking at that time. So anyway, getting forward to this documentary, I pitched this idea to the VFS teacher, and he happened to have a relationship with Super Channel. He said, "Well, write this up as a treatment, write this up as a story, and we'll take it to Super Channel." And Super Channel said, "Okay, if you guys can do this, but Anthony, you're just gonna work on this. Like you're not anything on this, but we like your idea, so you'll get a writing credit as a writer of the documentary. But obviously, like Shell, who was the producer, he's going to produce it." And I was like, "Okay, sure. This sounds great." So we got some funding from Super Channel and some other places, and Shell took me through this all about learning how to finance a project through the Canadian system, because a documentary and a feature are different but similar in how they get financed. I mean, you can go to different avenues to get money, but the idea is still the same. And this idea of like blended financing, and like there isn't just like $250,000 sitting there waiting for someone to go and make a movie. You've got to like do this and this and this, and you've got to make sure that this is happening before this happens. It's almost like a whole thing where everything happens on one day because nothing can happen until the other thing is happening. So everything is reliant on each other. Yeah, it's like selling a house in a way where it's like, nothing gets transferred until everything is in place in that one moment. And so I really learned a lot. And Shell gave me a really good piece of advice at the time. He said, your financial services background is probably going to do you a lot more good than your film school background. And I thought, oh, interesting. Okay. And I really learned that because the budget, like managing the budget and managing the cash flow and everything like that was actually a super important aspect of making a film. And so fast forward, we made the film, learned a lot, and learned a lot about making that film, like just learned a lot about the process of delivery and all these other things. When Super Channel went bankrupt, and the first time it went bankrupt, when it went bankrupt, and the only thing that was holding our film, that made our film still valid for them, that they still had to create the license, was if we hit the deadline. Like we had to make sure we fulfilled the terms of the contract. Well, so we had to rush to get the film completed and over to them and delivered to them by the deadline, because if not, there could be an argument that because the bankruptcy court and so on was like, okay, well, if we don't have to pay something, we're not going to pay it. And so I'm sitting there at I can't even remember the post studio because it doesn't exist anymore, but I'm sitting there at the post studio waiting for them to output an HD tape on a Friday so that I can take it over to FedEx, because it has to get to Toronto by Saturday morning. This is like my own pocket paying for this because we have zero money left in the bank for this. So I'm just like, I'm sitting there at the post house, and like outputting an HD copy means you have to play the whole thing. It has to record the whole thing, and it has to, go through a QC quality control check. And so like I had to make sure all of that was in place, and it's like afternoon, and I'm like, okay, the overnight delivery for FedEx to Toronto is cut off at like 4:30, I think, or something like that, or at that time. I have about a 15-minute window to get before, if there's any traffic, I might not hit the deadline, kind of thing. And I'm racing over to FedEx to like get it in the mail, get like the confirmation, send it over to Super Channel and say, okay, confirmed, here it is. It's in the pipeline. And then I was like watching it for like 24 hours to make sure that like see when it got delivered and so on, just to make sure it got delivered. And of course it did, and everything was fine. Like I got used to stress there very quickly.